Since we didn't get very far in this lecture, I'm going to begin by recapping a few of the things that we did talk about and then moving forward and completing the rest of the lecture. So if you recall, we talked about the fact that some people, specifically researchers and scholars, believe that the only way to really get an accurate read on a person is to see them and talk to them face to face. And so these same people might argue that verbal and nonverbal cues are not interchangeable. Or in other words, there are some things that you cannot communicate verbally that you can communicate nonverbally. But as we've talked about, language cues do in fact communicate social information, just like nonverbal cues, but they just may not do so as naturally or instantly. So we have a lot of access to information, or we have access to a lot of information in face-to-face interactions, right? So we talked about like invading personal space communicates dominance, maybe crossing your arms or turning your back on someone or avoiding eye contact with them communicates do not approach, or, I'm not interested in talking to you. Whereas on the other hand, making eye contact and maintaining an open body orientation communicates that you are approachable and willing to communicate. So these behaviors all serve as social functions, which allow people to basically get along and get ahead. But these messages, as we said, can be communicated through language too, through things like style and content. So for example, there's a difference between using formal language and informal language. There's a difference between communicating in very brief messages and very lengthy messages. We talked about your Twitter and Instagram handles and how those, kind of communicate certain things about an individual. And then, like I said before, we can still communicate things like dominance through mediated communication. So over texting someone or constantly commenting or liking their posts on social media can be perceived as an invasion of space, an expression of dominance, or, on the other hand, it could communicate that they're lonely and they just want to connect with someone. So social information processing theory explains how people get to know one another online without nonverbal cues and how they develop and manage relationships in the computer-mediated environment or just generally the mediated environment, because text messaging would fall under this particular type of communication as well. So we talked about the underlying assumptions of this particular theory. And we talked about one example of, using the word texty and how just the words people use or the way they communicate in mediated environments can certainly impact impressions that we form of them. And this also helps to elucidate the idea that mediated communication can be very unforgiving in many situations, as we, don't have some of the other personality cues that we would have in face-to-face communication. But altogether, these assumptions suggest that people can get to know one another and they can develop relationships online. They just do so more slowly and through different means than face-to-face interactions. And so to elaborate, on the information presented on the previous slide, the primary prediction of social information processing theory is with sufficient time for ample communicative exchanges to take place. Mediated communication facilitates an exchange of both personal and relational information sufficient for forming impressions and managing our various relationships. It just happens more slowly than in face-to-face interactions. And we went through the three central arguments of this particular theory. So social information is altered in mediated environments. And again, social information is all the things that influence how we form and manage impressions of other people. And it's also information that helps us manage and maintain relationships, communicate emotionally, and things like that. If you compare social information to task information, for example, task information would be information necessary to complete a given task. So for example, you need information about a wedding planner's experience and qualifications before deciding to hire that person. but you probably don't really need to get to know them on a more personal level. You just need to know that they can get the job done to your satisfaction. And then secondly, social information is translated into verbal and textual symbols. And these theorists argue that language and writing are no less important than nonverbal cues in managing impressions and relationships. So when nonverbal cues are not available, we simply rely on other ways of communicating that information. So in other words, language performs all of the various expressive functions. And then finally, exchanging social information is slower in mediated environments. So because language is the primary vehicle for communicating in computer-mediated communication, it makes sense that less information is being exchanged per message exchange. So overall, computer-mediated communication requires more message exchanges to reach the same level of impressions and relationship development as face-to-face interactions. So moving on from social information processing theory, hyperpersonal theory suggests that not only do computer-mediated communication partners overcome the limitations of CMC, but they use text-based communication to develop relationships that are more intimate than their face-to-face counterparts. So we hyper-personalize interactions to compensate for the lack of nonverbal information. And this occurs through self-presentation and partner idealization. So these theorists argue that relationships that develop via computer-mediated communication are more intimate for 4 reasons related to the characteristics of CMC. So we'll just put these up there. So the first is that the absence of nonverbal information allows users to present themselves more strategically and deliberately. So you may have, for example, an easier time engaging in strategic or selective self-presentation online because your partner only has access to the information you provide in the manner in which you provide it. So for example, you might be more careful with your word choice. You might be more careful or strategically choose what photo you make as your primary profile photo. What information you include in your Tinder profile. Those are all strategic and deliberate forms of self-presentation. Secondly, because there is limited information available, we overvalue the information we do have access to. So if you are strategically presenting yourself, you are probably presenting yourself in the most positive light, which may not be totally accurate. So this overly strategic self-presentation can lead to positively skewed impressions, which can then lead to increased feelings of intimacy or generally feeling closer to the person than would normally be true. So for example, thinking this person is so nice and thoughtful and they have a great sense of humor. They may be a lot funnier or, more clever through text-based channels. And then when you communicate with them face-to-face, you might just be sort of disappointed because you're expecting this person to be very humorous and clever with their jokes and their words. And it may even be easier to be nicer through mediated channels. And then third, the channel through which the communication occurs is very important because messages can be carefully planned and constructed and then edited before sending when the channel is text-based specifically. So like text messaging or Facebook Messenger or something like that. And I talked to you all about how I tend to type some text messages out in my notes first, so that way I can edit it before sending. And arguably, this principle applies to Snapchat photos and videos as well. You can put filters on them. You can alter them multiple times before you actually send them to someone. This is focusing on text-based communication, but arguably you could use this, or this would apply to image-based communication as well. And then finally, there is a feedback loop in computer-mediated interactions. So when you engage in strategic self-presentation, often the receiver will respond in a positive manner, which then basically influences you to then continue to behave in that particular way. So if you make a few jokes and the receiver responds positively, suggesting they appreciate your humor, you are then likely to continue to use humor to make them like you. So that brings us to the focal point here of self-disclosure. As self-disclosure is going to tie both of these theories together and connect it to the articles that you read for this week. So one thing we know about self-disclosure is that it's the primary way, and some people argue the only way, to move toward intimacy in our relationships. So disclosing personally relevant information, thoughts, and feelings fosters intimacy or closeness in a relationship. It also facilitates understanding, it increases liking, and it encourages reciprocation. So we know that the principle of reciprocity suggests that we disclose increasingly intimate information on a broad range of topics. So as intimacy increases, then relationships develop. So disclosures are characterized by generally 6 different dimensions. So you have depth and breadth. So depth would be the intimacy, how intimate the topic is. Breadth would be the number or the range of topics that you're allowed to discuss or that's appropriate to discuss in a particular relationship. Frequency and duration go hand in hand. So frequency is how often people disclose, like over time. Duration is the length of any particular disclosure. So you may disclose frequently with people that you work with, but those disclosures, those conversations are often shorter in duration. Whereas if you have a best friend or romantic partner that's long distance, you may spend more time in a single conversation, but those conversations, those disclosures are relatively infrequent. And then valence refers to how positive or negative the disclosure is. And honesty refers to how truthful the disclosure is, or how false it is, or if you're engaging in some kind of deception. So if we were in class, I would ask you, what would you assume that hyperpersonal theory predicts in regards to self-disclosure? So if you think about this question, increased perceptions of intimacy due to these hyperpersonal interactions likely lead to reciprocating disclosure, which then begets further disclosure. Now, this has received mixed support in various studies. So some scholars have found an increased frequency of disclosure and depth of disclosure, but not necessarily breadth of disclosure, while other scholars have found no differences between disclosures that occur in face-to-face contexts or in computer-mediated contexts. So that's kind of the landscape we're dealing with at the moment. So self-disclosure has been, or it's been suggested that it is one of the most salient and critical behaviors in computer-mediated communication. For example, bloggers write most frequently about personal experiences. Dating profiles and dating applications are all places where self-presentation is important. This is where people form impressions of others, and it may also be where people actually develop their relationships, especially in the early stages. Social media profiles share the same characteristics as dating profiles and applications, but social media profiles also include sharing, commenting, liking, kind of creeping on other people. So checking to see, who has seen what, those types of things. And your social media profiles and activities can also include information that people might stigmatize. So for example, your sexual orientation, your social and political views, maybe even drug and alcohol use, your religious affiliations, right? So you disclose a lot of personal information in many cases on your social media profiles or through your social media interactions. And then finally, you actually engage in interpersonal interactions online. So as I mentioned, self-disclosure is really important and prevalent in mediated communication. And there are characteristics that lead to more frequent and intimate disclosures. So for example, the absence of nonverbal cues and perhaps even the assumption of anonymity in mediated environments. So the characteristics of mediated communication might facilitate more frequent and intimate disclosures, which again leads to increased intimacy. So the assumption that that disclosure production directly leads to increased intimacy is an assumption. Well, it's an assumption that some people make, but this research has failed to consider how the receiver interprets the disclosure. So that's where we need to kind of pick up. So what are the reasons behind someone disclosing information to another person? Well, there are 3 broad options. So you might say, well, it's dispositional. So the receiver of the disclosure attributes the disclosure to the sender's personality. So you may assume that person is open, they're extroverted, or you might assume on the other hand that they're too forward. Some people, you might assume that they disclose intimate information to many people because of their personality. Secondly, we might make a situational attribution. So the receiver then attributes the disclosure to a situational factor, like the medium in which the disclosure occurred. We might also assume that people disclose intimate information to anyone in a similar circumstance. And then an interpersonal attribution would be when a receiver attributes the disclosure to the unique relationship between the sender and the receiver, in which the receiver was specifically targeted for the disclosure. So this person is telling me this information because we have a close relationship. They told me specifically this information. So this would suggest that this individual discloses intimate information because of this special relationship. So while research may show that people make more intimate disclosures in CMC, that doesn't necessarily mean that more disclosure leads to more intimacy in CMC compared to face-to-face. We need to examine the receiver's thought process to fully understand how intimacy is developed in these mediated relationships. So you read a study about hyperpersonal theory and its connection to self-disclosure. So in this particular article, they had 3 primary hypotheses. So the first hypothesis was that, given that CMC partners tend to overinterpret cues in the mediated environment, they would also likely overinterpret the meaning of the self-disclosures. So high self-disclosure leads to more intimacy in these mediated interactions than in the face-to-face interactions. And again, self-disclosure in CMC is highly salient because of the limited cues by which people exchange immediacy and affection. So the disclosure intimacy link should be intensified in CMC. The second hypothesis is that interpersonal attribution, so attributing when the receiver attributes the disclosure to an aspect of the interpersonal relationship, this should mediate this intensification effect of medium on the disclosure intimacy link. So self-disclosure and partner responsiveness should both influence perceptions of intimacy. So the sender discloses, which encourages a responsive behavior from the receiver, which then prompts further disclosure from the sender. So these responsive behaviors are things that communicate understanding, caring, support, those types of things. So the receiver's response then is influenced by how they interpret the sender's disclosure. So to what do we attribute the self-disclosure? Is it dispositional, situational, or interpersonal? When the receiver attributes self-disclosure interpersonally, it should enhance the relational intimacy because the receiver is thinking that that they have been personally chosen for the disclosure and that the sender likes and trusts them. Excuse me. And then finally, the effect of self-disclosure on interpersonal attributions is greater in mediated interactions compared to face-to-face. So CMC partners will overinterpret the meaning of self-disclosure, much like they overinterpret the information provided over text-based channels, by making more extreme interpersonal attributions for the disclosure in CMC relative to face-to-face. So to test these hypotheses, they recruited undergraduate students, and those students communicated with a research confederate either face-to-face or through a mediated channel. And just to clarify, a research confederate is usually someone involved in the research project. So this is someone who is aware of what is going on. They're often trained in a particular way to behave in a particular way or to have a particular type of discussion. And so in this particular design, they basically paired an undergraduate student with a researcher. And in the face-to-face conditions, they had those two people interact in a meeting room, and there was a one-way mirror, and they gave them 10 minutes to interact. And then in the computer-mediated condition, they put each person in 2 separate rooms. They had them communicate via AOL Instant Messenger, and they gave them 30 minutes because, as we know, it should take more time to reach the same level of intimacy in mediated communication than in face-to-face. And then they gave them a discussion task. So they couldn't just talk about whatever they wanted to. The task was to propose 10 college survival tips for first-year students. So the discussion was structured so that the participant and the confederate took turns suggesting their own tips, but the confederate always started first. So each person had to contribute 5 tips along with their reasons for each tip. And at the end of the discussion, they had to agree on the 2 tips that they thought were most important for the first-year college experience. Now, the supporting arguments differed in intimacy level for the 3rd and the 4th tips that the confederate suggested between the 2 self-disclosure conditions. So the supporting arguments for the high intimacy disclosure tips involved a discussion of personal problems, and they also made more self-references, whereas the supporting arguments in the low intimacy disclosure tips made no reference to personal experience. So the confederates, like I said, were trained for both nonverbal behaviors. So in the face-to-face situation, they came off more naturally, but they were also trained in typographic behaviors. And then after the discussion task, they had the participants complete a questionnaire that measured their primary variables of interest. So they asked them about the attributions they made, so the dispositional, situational, and interpersonal. And then they also asked them questions about how intimate they felt the interaction was. So just to show you what was happening, so on the left, you have the high intimacy disclosures. So the confederate said, well, you have to eat right. And they said it's very important to stick to a balanced diet. I gained 20 pounds. Someone asked me if I was pregnant. Compared to the low intimacy disclosure, where the confederate said, do you know the freshman 15 Freshmen gain 15 pounds in the first year because they don't have family there to serve balanced meals. And then for the exercise regularly tips, the high intimacy disclosures included talking about how their life was a mess, parents were getting divorced, I was sick for a week, so I started yoga, and that really helped to relax and take the stress away, compared to, generally doing exercises helps relieve stress, it improves physical health and mental health, and it helps people deal with problems in a positive way. So again, this is just to kind of show you the experimental design. So you had what we call two manipulations. So they manipulated the context. Was it a computer-mediated context or a face-to-face context? And then in that context, did the Confederate engage in high self-disclosure or high intimacy self-disclosure, or did they engage in low intimacy self-disclosure? And so to take this by each of the individual hypotheses, the first hypothesis predicted that high self-disclosure leads to more intimacy and mediated communication. And so what they found was that the disclosure intimacy link was in fact intensified in the mediated communication, and self-disclosure did lead to more intimacy in the CMC conditions compared to the face-to-face conditions. So this hypothesis was supported then. The second hypothesis was also supported. They found that situational and dispositional attributions did not mediate the effect of disclosure on intimacy. It was only the interpersonal attributions that were shown to mediate the effects of disclosure on intimacy. So that was also supported. And then finally, for the third hypothesis, the results revealed that high intimacy self-disclosure led to more intense interpersonal attributions in the mediated interactions only. So when communicating through a mediated channel, and when the Confederate revealed personal information, personally intimate information, the receivers, the participants, attributed that disclosure to the unique interpersonal relationship between the two of them. In other words, the receivers assumed that this person is telling me this specifically. They're targeting me for this disclosure, and that was true only in the mediated interactions. It was not true in the face-to-face interactions. So these hypotheses were all supported. In the face-to-face participants did not differ in their attributions when the disclosure was high or low. So the face-to-face participants basically didn't say, this attribution was due to personality or to the situation or to the interpersonal relationship. It really didn't make a difference for them. Okay, so to go back to social information processing theory and connect that to self-disclosure, you read a study from Ruppel and colleagues in which they wanted to examine the differences in self-disclosure in CMC context and in face-to-face context. So the authors draw from social information processing theory as well as hyperpersonal theory. So they were looking at whether or not their findings would support one or both of these theories. So they begin with social information processing theory, and they note a few things that we've already discussed, notably that relationships may develop more slowly in CMC contexts, but can certainly reach levels of relationships developed face-to-face. Additionally, they argue that the lack of nonverbal information available in computer-mediated contexts leads people to exchange more relational or social information than they would in face-to-face contexts. In this, the exchange is both intentional and it's goal-oriented. And that goal is to get to know someone, to form an impression of them, and to reduce uncertainty about that person. So another thing that we know about self-disclosure is that it helps to reduce our uncertainty about our interaction partner because we're gaining information. So disclosure is an information-seeking strategy. And in fact, it has been found that we tend to ask more questions and disclose more information in computer-mediated contexts compared to face-to-face contexts. So their primary prediction is that self-disclosure will be higher in computer-mediated communication because it's really the only way to form a relationship and to develop reduce uncertainty. So the study read by Ruppel and colleagues was what we call a meta-analysis, which means that the authors compiled a bunch of already existing studies that have examined self-disclosure as it occurs in both computer-mediated contexts and in face-to-face contexts, with the goal of determining if disclosure differs across contexts, and if so, how it differs. So they compiled a number of studies that have examined this particular phenomenon, and by doing so they were able to examine the results from all those previous studies to see if they were impacted by things like study design. So was it a survey or was it an experiment? They were able to look at differences in channel, so text-based versus video-based. They were able to look at if participants differed in any way, and just any other elements that might have affected the interpretation of the results in each of the original studies. So what they found across multiple studies was that self-disclosure was higher in the face-to-face contexts than the CMC contexts, which is counter to what social information processing theory and hyperpersonal theory predict. Right? So these findings call both of these theoretical frameworks into question. And this was true regardless of whether or not the computer-mediated communication was video or if it was solely text-based. But what they did find was that the difference between disclosure in the face-to-face and conversation and the video conversation was smaller than the difference between disclosures in face-to-face situations and text-based mediated communication. So in other words, disclosing information through like Skype or FaceTime is more similar to face-to-face than disclosing information in like text messaging or like a messenger app or something like that. They also found that both depth and breadth of disclosure, so how many topics we can talk about and how intimate those conversations are, both of those were higher in face-to-face interactions compared to CMC interactions. But they did find that the difference between the face-to-face and the CMC interactions in depth was bigger than the difference between face-to-face and CMC in breadth. So in other words, people tend to be okay maybe discussing a lot of different topics in mediated interactions, and that's more similar to how many topics they discuss in face-to-face interactions compared to how intimate those conversations are. And then finally, participants across these studies reported more self-disclosure in face-to-face contexts when they were asked about it on a survey. But experimental settings did not necessarily find this difference, which means that there might be a difference in these findings, or these findings might be influenced by how we capture them. So if we ask people, how much do you disclose in face-to-face interactions compared to computer-mediated interactions, they're going to say, well, I disclose more in face-to-face interactions, which might be a desirability bias. Because as you all talked about in class, some of you said, well, if I see somebody's profile is public, then I kind of judge them negatively. So those individuals who are asked, do you disclose more information online or face-to-face? They may be aware of these negative judgments, and therefore they may respond differently. Now, when you examine the intimacy of self-disclosure in an experimental setting, like the previous study that we read, they did not find any difference in how much self-disclosure occurred in face-to-face compared to mediated communication. So there are some implications for social information processing theory. So first of all, there was a very small number of experiments in this particular meta-analysis that included time as a variable. And this is important for predictions related to or based on social information processing theory, because the theory predicts that it takes more time to develop relationships due to the text-based nature of the communication that's occurring. And then in terms of hyperpersonal theory predicts that relationships that develop in mediated environments become more intimate because of the reliance on text-based channels. But this study found that both depth and breadth were higher in face-to-face contexts, and that self-disclosure was higher in the video-based CMC compared to the text-based. But on the other hand, the studies included in the analysis did not assess the nature of the relationships examined, and most of them were pre-existing and used both online and offline communication. So that could be the nature of the relationship could be impacting the type of disclosure or how intimate the disclosure is that is occurring. So these are things to think about. But it is important to note that this study was from 2007, which is more recent than the other study that you read. So there perhaps is more information provided to evaluate these two theoretical frameworks. So at this point, I would normally ask kind of what you think about the situation. So do you think text-based communication is impersonal, or do you think it's hyper-personal, or somewhere in between? And one of the questions I normally like to ask is, would you prefer that if someone's going to ask you out, would you prefer they do it in a face-to-face format? Would you prefer they do it over the phone? Or would you prefer they do it in some kind of mediated channel, whether that's text messaging or a messaging app on like a dating service or Tinder or something like that? And the reason I throw phone calls in there is that they're kind of in between face-to-face and computer-mediated communication. So you have more access to nonverbal information. You have to be a little bit more spontaneous on the phone, but you still can't necessarily see the other person on the other line. And a lot of people admit that they get freaked out when somebody calls them, and they would just prefer to either talk face-to-face or to text, but they don't want to actually talk to somebody on the phone. And so my question would be, is there a circumstance where it's okay or even preferable to call someone? And some people are going to say, no, not at all. Other people might say something like, well, if there's an emergency situation, or if I'm sharing something personal or exciting, like good news, something like that, I might make a phone call. So for example, if you get a promotion or if you get engaged and you want to share that information with your close family and friends, it's probably not terribly appropriate to text them that information. But if you're not going to be able to see them and communicate that information face to face, a phone call might be appropriate. But it's important to note that voice calls peaked in 2007, which at this point was 12 years ago, which is kind of a funny thing that something that I think is humorous, because I grew up only relying on telephone. But I'm sure you all probably have family members, maybe your parents don't even have an actual landline in their home. This is a quote from an individual who basically said, I have social anxiety and having to respond or react on the spot to a phone call or in person would make me overanalyze everything and put myself into a tizzy. I would want to take my time and think of a response that's genuine. And that's the part that gets me, is that if you're taking your time, you're planning your response more strategically and deliberately, which arguably is not quite as genuine or authentic. Additionally, I think that you might, or we might, overanalyze a text message without nonverbal cues. And if you have to think of a response, it's likely not very genuine. But then there are some people who say, so if you ask people about their preferences in terms of being asked out on a date, like if they've met somebody online, a phone call kind of allows the individual to, the quote in an article I read was, for women, it allowed them to separate the men from the boys. So an individual who picked up the phone and called was seen as maybe a little bit more genuine, braver, more confident, wanted to kind of get things done, get the ball rolling. And it also made women feel safer, which contradicts social information processing theory, because it prioritizes the nonverbal information that you can gather from somebody's voice, and also the interpretations that you associate with just the simple act of calling. And then another question I like to ask is, do you think computer-mediated communication or mediated communication facilitates flakiness and rudeness? So is it easier to cancel on people? Is it easier to lie about why you can't attend something that they've invited you to? Things like that. And that's usually an interesting discussion, and I'm sure you all have thoughts on that as well. This is usually an in-class activity, so I'll go ahead and just stop here. We can pick this up on Thursday, but I'm going to also move on Thursday to our next scheduled lecture.